It began in a small southern town where power wore a uniform and prejudice hid behind badges. The woman they mocked had done nothing wrong. She was arrested on a minor charge, something so trivial that most people would have walked away with a warning. But that night, the cells echoed with cruelty disguised as authority. They laughed as they dragged her in, a young black woman with dignity in her eyes. And when they forced her into the chair, the humiliation began. Her hair, thick and beautiful, a symbol of identity and pride, became the target of their scorn. One officer held her down while another picked up the clippers, and as her curls fell to the floor, the room filled with laughter, harsh, mocking, the kind of laughter that strips a person of their humanity. They joked about her looks, her race, her worth, and she sat there silently, her tears mixing with the buzz of the machine. But deep inside her, a seed was planted, a quiet vow that one day, they would see her not as a victim, but as something greater when she left that cell. She didn't just carry the pain of humiliation. She carried the fire of transformation. Every sneer, every word, every sound of laughter replayed in her mind like a mantra of defiance. She returned to her studies, determined not to let their cruelty define her story. She went back to school, buried herself in books, in law, in justice, the very system that once allowed her humiliation to happen. The same system that failed her would become her weapon. She studied relentlessly, driven not by revenge but by purpose, to ensure that no one else would endure what she had faced. Her pain became her discipline, her silence became her strength, and each page she turned was a step away from the woman they tried to break years past. The world moved on, but she did not forget. When she finally stood before the bar, graduating with honors, the clapping of her peers drowned out the ghostly echoes of their laughter. She entered the legal system not as a powerless figure, but as a protector of justice. She took cases that others ignored, those involving abuse, discrimination, the unseen injustices that lingered beneath polished courtrooms and smiling officials. Her name began to carry weight, her calm presence commanded respect, and soon, her reputation spread far beyond the town that once mocked her. She became known for her poise, her integrity, her refusal to be swayed by power or emotion. And then came the day she was appointed as a judge. The announcement sent quiet ripples through the town. People remembered her name, some vaguely, some vividly. Among them were those same officers, older now, perhaps comfortable in their authority, assuming their actions from years ago had been buried with time. But time, as she knew, does not erase truth. It only waits for the right moment to reveal it. When the trial was scheduled, and the accused names appeared before her, the silence that filled the courtroom was almost sacred. The officers recognized her instantly. The same woman they had ridiculed now sat above them, robed in black, the embodiment of justice they had once mocked. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by unease and disbeliefs. She looked at them, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. There was no smirk, no trace of satisfaction, only the weight of dignity. In that silence, they understood something deeper than guilt. They felt the gravity of their own humanity mirrored back at them. She did not need to speak of what they had done. Her presence alone was enough to remind them. The trial was not about her past humiliation, but about their present accountability. Yet everyone in that courtroom knew that history was folding in on itself, that justice had come full circle. The evidence was laid out clearly. Complaints from others, testimonies of misconduct, the pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for years. They tried to defend themselves, their voices trembling slightly, searching for the authority they once wielded so effortlessly. But in that room, their words carried no weight. The tone of superiority they once used was gone. Every question she asked cut through their defenses like the hum of the same clippers they once held against her will. Her voice was steady, professional, unwavering. It was not vengeance. It was justice as it was meant to be measured. Impartial, unshakable. Reporters later described the atmosphere as electric, heavy, almost reverent. People whispered that they had never seen such poise under pressure, such control of power without using it to harm. What they didn't realize was that she had already faced her trial years before, in that cold cell, when she learned the true face of cruelty and refused to let it define her. Now, she was the mirror that reflected the consequences of their actions. The laughter that once humiliated her had turned into a lesson, echoing through the courtroom in silence, each second a reminder of what unchecked authority can become. Her judgment was not born from anger, but from truth. She applied the law as it was written, but the weight behind her words carried the wisdom of lived pain. When the verdict was read, there was no applause, no visible triumph, only stillness. The same silence that once accompanied her humiliation now stood as her quiet victory. The officers lowered their heads, not because of punishment, but because of shame. In that moment, they understood what their laughter had cost not just her, but their own sense of morality. She had risen beyond them, not by erasing the past, but by mastering it afterward. When she walked out of the courthouse, the sun hid her face, and she paused for a moment, feeling the weight lift slightly from her shoulders. The world outside buzzed with murmurs, news vans, and flashing lights, but she heard none of it. All she could think of was the young woman in that cell, scared but unbroken, and how far she had come. The same hands that were once bound in humiliation now held the gavel of justice. The same eyes that once looked up at her abusers now looked down upon their actions with measured grace. Power had changed hands, but it had done so with dignity, not cruelty. She understood that true justice was not about reversing roles, it was about restoring balance in the years that followed. Her story became a quiet legend. Law students spoke of her not as a symbol of revenge, but as the embodiment of resilience. She never gave interviews about what had happened. She never needed to. Her silence spoke volumes. Her actions told the story better than words ever could. The officers faded into obscurity, while she continued to preside, ensuring that every person who stood before her, no matter their color, status, or history, was treated with the fairness she was once denied. Her courtroom became a place where laughter was replaced by respect, where justice was not just a word but a living, breathing principle, born from one woman's strength to rise above humiliation and turn it into purpose. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint hum of air conditioning and the shuffle of papers. Every seat was filled, yet no one dared to speak above a whisper. Reporters leaned forward, their pens ready, cameras poised to capture what would soon become a defining moment. The same town that once dismissed a young black woman's pain was now watching her stand as a judge, the embodiment of authority and grace. The officers seated before her looked uneasy, their faces betraying a mix of disbelief and guilt. Once, they had been untouchable, symbols of law and order, but now, the tables had turned not through vengeance, but through the slow, steady hand of justice. The laughter they once shared had vanished, swallowed by the gravity of accountability. The weight of justice filled the air, thick and suffocating, pressing down on those who had used the law as a weapon in the days before the trial. Word had spread that the presiding judge had a history with the accused. Some thought it was rumor, others dismissed it as coincidence. But those who knew her past understood the irony that fate had crafted. The same woman who had once been humiliated under fluorescent lights now sat under the soft glow of courtroom chandeliers, the symbol of fairness itself. It was as if time had been waiting for this exact moment, when cruelty would meet consequence in the same space where arrogance had once echoed. Justice, long delayed, had not been denied, it had simply taken the form of patience. Wrapped in silence, and armed with truth as the proceedings began, the officers sat rigid, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the woman on the bench. Her presence unsettled them, not because of who she was now, but because of what she represented. Every decision she made, every question she asked, was a reminder that the system they had once manipulated was no longer theirs to command. She did not raise her voice, nor did she display any emotion. Her calm demeanor was her strength, her neutrality her weapon. The law had failed her once, but she had chosen not to fail it in return. That was the true weight of justice, to uphold it even when it once broke youth. Prosecutor laid out the evidence meticulously, videos of misconduct, statements from victims, internal reports that had been buried or ignored. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about years of unchecked abuse, protected by silence and fear. The defense tried to paint the officers as misunderstood, claiming that the system was against them now, but their words lacked conviction. They could not erase the facts, nor could they erase the memory of what they had done. The irony was unbearable for them. Justice had always been an abstract concept, something applied to others. Now, they were forced to face it directly, and for the first time, they understood its true weight. Every time the judge spoke, the courtroom listened. Her tone was steady, professional, almost detached. But beneath that calm surface was the unmistakable authority of someone who knew the cost of injustice. Her gaze didn't linger on them, but when it did, it was enough to make them look away. The power dynamic that once defined their interactions had completely reversed. Not through force, but through moral gravity. It was not the kind of justice that came with fire or fury. It was cold, deliberate, and exacting, the kind that demands reflection rather than punishment. The silence between her words spoke louder than any sentence could. People outside the courtroom debated her composure. Some said she should have recused herself, that personal history might cloud her judgment. But those who understood the law knew she was doing exactly what justice required, rising above personal pain to deliver fairness even to those who had denied it to her. That was the true essence of accountability. It wasn't about retribution, it was about restoring balance. And in that moment, as the trial unfolded, balance was finally being restored as testimony after testimony exposed the depths of corruption. A quiet shift occurred in the room. The public began to see what she had seen years ago, the rot that hides behind authority, the cruelty that thrives in unchecked power. Her story was no longer just her own. It had become a reflection of countless others who had suffered in silence. The officers, once symbols of control, now sat small and powerless under the gaze of the very system they had perverted. Their arrogance melted into discomfort, then into shame. They tried to meet her eyes once or twice, perhaps hoping for a flicker of anger or resentment, something that would make her seem human enough to hate them. But what they found instead was something far more terrible. She had mastered herself, and in doing so, mastered them. When the evidence was complete, and the final witnesses had spoken, the courtroom felt suspended in time. The officers shifted in their seats, their confidence long gone. Their lawyers whispered last-minute arguments, but even they knew it was futile. The weight of justice was undeniable. She sat there, listening, her hands folded calmly, her expression unchanging. She didn't need to remind anyone of the past. Everyone in that room already felt its shadow. The same laughter that had once filled a cell now hung like a ghost between them, transformed into silence dense enough to make hearts race. That was the sound of accountability, the absence of laughter where cruelty once lived. When she finally spoke, the entire courtroom leaned forward. Her words were not dramatic. They were measured, deliberate, each syllable carrying the force of truth. She acknowledged the facts, cited the law, and delivered her ruling with precision. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of personal vendetta. Her sentence was fair, appropriate, and bound by justice, not emotion. Yet, even without saying it, everyone knew what this moment meant. It was the culmination of years of imbalance finally tipping toward equity. The officers were not just facing legal punishment. They were facing the moral reckoning of their own choices. As the gavel struck, the sound echoed like thunder, breaking the stillness that had gripped the room. The officers' heads bowed, the crowd remained hushed, and she simply sat there, composed, dignified. For her, there was no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet affirmation that justice, when wielded properly, can heal what cruelty once shattered. The same system that had once allowed her suffering had now been redeemed, at least in part, through her hands. She had proven that power could be reclaimed without bitterness, that silence could be stronger than vengeance. When the courtroom emptied, she remained seated for a while, staring at the empty chairs where her past had just been judged. The weight she had carried for so long had not disappeared, but it had transformed. Justice, she realized, is not about erasing penance, about giving it purpose. The laughter that once humiliated her had become the echo of her triumph, not because she silenced it, but because she replaced it with truth. And as she stood to leave, the officers were led away quietly, their heads still lowered, their power undone not by anger, but by accountability. The silence that fell upon that courtroom was not just the end of a trial, it was the sound of justice finally breathing. The day she walked into the courtroom, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The same corridors that had once echoed with the mockery of men in uniform now whispered her name with reverence. Years ago, she had entered a different room, handcuffed, humiliated, stripped of her dignity, as laughter filled the air around her. But this time, every eye in the room followed her, not with derision, but with respect. Her robe flowed behind her like a banner of survival, her steps deliberate, her expression calm. It wasn't triumph that she carried, it was something deeper, a quiet reckoning that spoke of pain transformed into purpose. The woman who once suffered in silence now presided over the very institution that had failed to protect her, and the men who once laughed at her sat waiting for her judgment. When the trial began, the officers avoided her gaze. They had aged, the arrogance of youth replaced by the heaviness of consequence. Their faces showed the same discomfort that had once been hers, but there was no gloating in her eyes, no hint of revenge. She knew that power misused corrodes both the victim and the abuser, and she refused to let that poison define her. Redemption, she understood, wasn't about watching them fall, it was about proving that cruelty cannot destroy character. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, not with fear, but with awareness. Every person present could feel that something extraordinary was unfolding, not a spectacle, but a moment of moral symmetry, where life had drawn its own balance without needing permission. Her journey to this point had been long and unforgiving. After that night of humiliation, she had disappeared from sight, but not from purpose. While they laughed and forgot, she remembered. She studied harder than she ever thought possible, immersing herself in law and justice, determined to master the very system that had once betrayed her. Every late night, every exam, every setback, had been another brick in the fortress she built within herself. She didn't chase titles or recognition, she sought understanding, the kind that would allow her to rise above bitterness. When she passed the bar, when she took her oath, she didn't smile for cameras or celebrate loudly. She simply stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself. The same eyes that once held tears, now held resolve. Her victory was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to herself that she could not be broken. The day she became a judge, she didn't expect fate to loop back so perfectly. Yet when the file crossed her desk and she saw their names, her breath caught for a moment. The irony was undeniable. The same men who once represented the law were now defendants standing trial for violating it. The circle was complete, but she didn't allow emotion to dictate her path. She had learned that true power lies in restraint. Her preparation for the case was meticulous, impartial, rooted in fact, not feeling. Still, she could not ignore the quiet pulse of memory that lingered beneath every line of evidence, every testimony. The universe, it seemed, had given her an opportunity not to punish, but to demonstrate what justice truly looks like when wielded by someone who has known injustice firsthand. The courtroom buzzed with curiosity when the trial began. People expected confrontation, perhaps some display of anger or poetic irony. Instead, they saw professionalism so precise it was almost unsettling. She addressed the lawyers with respect, listened carefully to every statement, and treated the officers not as enemies but as citizens, subject to law. The public wanted a spectacle of revenge, but what they received was a lesson in integrity. Her calm demeanor was disarming. Those who once viewed her as powerless now saw the quiet force of dignity, something no uniform, no badge, no authority could fabricate. It was the kind of power born from survival, the unshakable confidence of someone who had already faced the worst and learned to rise when the officers took the stand. They could barely meet her eyes. Each question she asked was precise, methodical, cutting through excuses with surgical grace. She never referenced the past, never hinted at what had been done to her. Yet everyone in that room felt the invisible weight of history pressing down between judge and defendant. Their laughter from years ago had become the very silence that now condemned them. They realized too late that cruelty leaves a trail, that power abused eventually circles back to demand its price. Her composure unnerved them more than any anger could have. They expected rage, and instead found grace. That, perhaps, was their true punishment, to see that the woman they had once dehumanized had become the living embodiment of what they had failed to be outside the courtroom. The story spread quickly. Headlines spoke of poetic justice, of destiny's strange symmetry, but she rejected those narratives. To her, this was not about fate or irony, it was about accountability. Justice had to be impartial, even when personal history threatened to blur its edges. She carried that burden quietly, aware that her role demanded more than fairness. It demanded forgiveness without forgetting. In her silence, there was both strength and sorrow. She knew that no verdict could erase the memory of that night, nor could it fully redeem a system that had once allowed such cruelty to exist. But what she could do was redefine it, reshape it into something better. One case at a time. When she finally delivered her verdict, her words were steady, deliberate, the tone of someone who understood both suffering and responsibility. She spoke not as a victim, but as a custodian of justice. Her decision was fair, rooted in law, untainted by emotion, and yet, beneath the surface, her message was unmistakable. She didn't need to remind them of who she was or what they had done. Her very presence was a reminder enough. As the gavel struck, the sound carried through the room like a pulse of finality. The laughter that once haunted her was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt almost sacred. In that stillness, she found her redemption not through revenge, but through control. Through the calm assurance that she had transcended what was meant to destroy her. When the officers were led away, they looked back one last time. Perhaps they sought some trace of hatred or triumph in her eyes, something that would make their guilt easier to bear. But she gave them nothing, only the same composed expression she had worn throughout. That was the final lesson, the unspoken truth of power. It does not need to shout to be heard. As they disappeared through the doors, she exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in recognition. She had not just judged them, she had faced her past and mastered it. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was peace after the trial. She sat alone in her chambers for a long while, her robe folded neatly beside her. She thought of that young woman from years ago, trembling in a cell, humiliated yet unbroken. She wished she could reach back through time and tell her that one day, those tears would become the foundation of her strength, that one day, the same walls that confined her would echo with her voice, steady and commanding. Her journey had not erased the pain, it had transformed it into wisdom. That was the redemption she had earned, not through the fall of others, but through her own rise. In the months that followed, she continued her work quietly, taking each case with the same impartiality, the same unshakable commitment to fairness. But everyone who entered her courtroom could feel something different about her, a gravity that came not from authority, but from lived truth. She had become a symbol, though she never sought to be one, of what justice could look like when shaped by empathy instead of ego. Her name became synonymous with integrity, her story told in whispers across law schools and police academies. The men who once mocked her were forgotten, but she endured, not as a reminder of vengeance, but as proof that redemption and reckoning can coexist. That silence, when born from strength, can speak louder than cruelty ever could.